Welcome to the KMG Fiduciary Partners Podcast. Here, we'll cover important topics on financial planning and asset management to help keep you informed and inspired for long-term success on your financial journey. Let's join the KMG team now for today's topic. Welcome to 10-Minute Advisor, brought to you by KMG Fiduciary Partners. My name is Cameron Kaiser, and I am a CFP professional and a wealth advisor with KMG. I'm here with Rob Thompson, who is a CPA and also a wealth advisor with KMG. Rob, can you go ahead and explain the topic of this video to everyone?
Sure. So today we're going to discuss the history of Social Security, general mechanics behind Social Security, taxation, and of course we're going to obviously address when you should take Social Security. And we're going to try to do all of this in 10 minutes or less.
All right, great. So as always, we have our producer Mark here with a stopwatch, so we can at least try to stay within the objective of 10 minutes or less. So can you hit the start button on that thing?
All right, go ahead.
Awesome. All right, so it probably makes the most sense to start off by just going over the history of Social Security. You want to take a crack at that?
Sure, and it's actually a pretty long history. So we actually need to go back all the way to just after the Civil War. We're talking 1862. At this point in time, we had a disproportionate number of people that were disabled just as a direct consequence from active military duty. And it was a time that we hadn't seen something like this before. And what was happening is the breadwinners of the family were disabled. They couldn't go out and earn income at this point. And there were a lot of people suffering. So the government rolled out a Civil War pension program. And this was kind of the first of its type. And it really alleviated some of the stress of these families that were dealing with, having their income earner fight in a war.
Sure.
So the reason that we, look back on this as, having anything to do with Social Security is because this sort of paved the way for, what we would end up deploying as far as Social Security goes in just under 100 years from the time that the Civil War pension plan started. So this basically laid out the groundwork for what would later, kind of become Social Security. And like I'd mentioned before, what the government did is they would pay benefits to someone that was, severely injured or disabled from active military duty. But you didn't necessarily get a pension if you just served and, you had no physical ailments that, forced you out of work. So that was something that was addressed later on. So in 1906, they determined that old age was actually a qualification, so you would actually be allowed to take a Civil War pension benefit. This is the first time that old age was seen as something that would qualify as not so much a disability, but just a factor that they would look at when determining somebody's Civil War pension benefit. So, quick fun fact, in 1999, this was the last year that a Civil War pension benefit was paid out to a beneficiary.
Oh, wow, not too long ago.
It was not long ago at all. So anyways, basically there were three factors that essentially led to the creation of the Social Security program. So the first was really, we're talking about the 1900s to 1930s, that time frame. And in that 30 years, the average American lifespan increased by 10 years. That was in part due to, we finally figured out that we needed to wash our hands and take care of ourselves. So health and sanitation was something that was on the rise, but 10 years is a long time to add to the average lifespan. So the other thing that we need to consider is the fact that for the first time in American history, in the 1920s, around that time period, we actually had more people moving into cities rather than being on farmland or anything like that. So we had a denser population, and it also means that those people weren't necessarily equipped to provide themselves food or anything else if they couldn't go buy it, right?
Sure.
So these two things, and then throw in, I don't know if you've heard of it, but the Great Depression that took place
Sounds familiar.
So the stock market crashed in 1929, and after all the chips had fallen, this is basically what we were looking at. We had an aging population that was living longer than basically any U.S. population had in the past, and by 10 years, right? Significant. We were looking at a denser population of people that weren't able to provide for themselves in terms of basic needs like food, because they would work maybe a more industrialized job. People didn't have the farmland that they once did as far as every family having land that they lived off of. It was a change in time period and the times. And when we're kind of factoring all these things in, people living longer, the stock market crashing and causing not just a recession but a depression impacted not just working Americans, but obviously had a significant impact on those that were already retired, right? So those that had been retired for several years and also were kind of projected to live longer than any generation prior to them were kind of facing an uphill battle because they lost a ton of value in anything that they had set aside and basically were set to run or outlive their assets. So the government stepped in. President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1935 signed the Social Security Act into place, and this was really designed for those aged 65 or older to have some form of continuing income after retirement. And the first check, fun fact, was sent out in 1940 to a woman named Ida Mae Fuller, and it was in the amount of $22.54, which if we adjusted that for inflation today, it would be about $450. So not huge, but that was the first of its type, so a big deal there.
Sure.
But really, since it was enacted back in 1935, the Social Security Act and the Social Security program has gone through several amendments, tweaks, changes, but at the root of all this, it's still a system that's designed for retired Americans that's funded by working Americans.
Sure.
So do you want to, Cam, just go over sort of the mechanics or the function of Social Security?
Yeah, so before I even jump into this, I think it's important to disclose that Social Security is extremely vast and can be complex. And just so we can keep this within 10 minutes and not 10 hours, I'm going to be as general as possible of talking about exactly what it is, how it works, and how you become eligible. So as you mentioned earlier, what Social Security is it is a federal insurance program in the United States that provides income to retirees, certain disabled people, and in certain situations, death benefits to qualifying beneficiaries. And it's what's known as a pay-as-you-go system, which means that the Social Security taxes you pay today, typically 6.2% from you and 6.2% from your employer, go to fund people that are currently withdrawing funds for Social Security, with the anticipation that one day when you take funds, that the current taxpayer at the time will fund that. Think of it as a pipeline that goes from current taxpayer to current beneficiary. So how you become eligible is as you work and pay Social Security taxes, you earn what are called Social Security credits. In 2022, you earn one credit for each $1,510 you make, up into a maximum of 4 credits per year. Most people need at least 40 credits to become eligible. It's roughly 10 years of work to qualify for benefits, but again, there are exceptions, right? If you have a spouse that has benefits, or if you become disabled early in life, then you don't necessarily need 40 credits, but that's just the general rule of thumb. And again, I think it's important to point out that the two main factors that are going to impact how much you're actually entitled to each month are when you start taking it. So as most people know, you can start taking it as early as 62. But if you can continue to defer it up until age 70, where it increases each month that you defer it. After age 70, there's no real incentive or benefit at all to not taking the funds. So the very latest you want to take at 70. The other factor is what your 40 highest credits are. So all things equal, if you make $50,000 your entire working career and paying Social Security, you're going to have a lower benefit than someone that pays in Social Security and made $150,000 their entire working career.
Yeah, and that makes a ton of sense. I think it's important to point out, though, I'm going to jump in really quick, and I'll keep it simple and broad because
Sure.
There are still nuances here. If you were a teacher or you have some sort of government pension, it'll impact this. But
of course,
typically, if maybe there was only one income earner in the household and the other spouse didn't have, 40 work credits for Social Security purposes, that spouse that didn't meet the criteria to receive a Social Security benefit under their own work history is actually still entitled to half of the spouse's benefit.
Sure.
So it's important to point that out. And that may not be the case for everyone because it depends on what you did in your career or if.
And generally speaking, if their spouse has a higher benefit and they pass away, then they are granted whatever the spouse's benefit was.
Yeah.
Right. So Rob, you being the CPA and all, Can you jump into the taxability of Social Security? It's probably the second most asked about question we get relating to Social Security, with the exception being when to actually take Social Security.
We are at 10 minutes.
All right, well, let's try to...
I'll make it quick. So I'm just going to, for the sake of simplicity, be speaking when it comes to the numbers, specifically on just joint tax return filers. So basically, if your modified adjusted gross income falls below $32,000, none of your Social Security is subject to income tax. The next, I'm going to call it range of income that we look at is if you have modified adjusted gross income between $32,000 and $44,000. If you fall in that range, then 50% of your Social Security benefit will be includable as taxable income on your tax return.
And keep in mind too, again, this should go without saying, but 50% of it is taxable. It doesn't mean you lose 50% of
right.
your
You're not. It's not a 50% tax rate.
Yep.
It's just that 50% is going to be tacked on to your ordinary income. And then the last sort of income limit threshold that determines how much your Social Security is taxable is when you get above $44,000 of modified adjusted gross income. At that point, and then no matter how much more you make or earn or whatever the case may be, it's 85% of that Social Security is includable as income. So that's sort of the threshold limit. So they're pretty low. We're talking about a joint tax return. So typically what we see is people landing in the at least 50% taxability of Social Security, if not more often. I would say more often than not, it's probably at least 85%.
Sure.
So Cam, I'm going to leave this one up to you. I'm going to leave the easy one. It's a softball. When's the best time to take Social Security?
Yeah, real softball. I hate to give you a empty response, but it really just depends. Because like we said before, there's so many different factors that are going to decide when to actually take it. You know, how long do you plan on working? What's your health like? What's your family's health history like? Do you have a spouse that's significantly older that has a larger benefit than you? Yada, yada, yada. You need to meet with, so it's very important to meet with somebody that fully understands your entire financial situation, that can actually look at these and try to figure out when it makes the most sense. So it obviously depends from person to person, and to answer your question, it really just depends.
Yep. So we'll take the lawyer's way out and say it depends. But I
so
think
we went
yeah.
way more than over. Please hit the stop button on that. We promise in future episodes to try to keep it within 10 minutes or at least close to it. But Social Security, as we point out multiple times throughout this whole podcast, is extremely, extremely complex, and there's a lot to it. We could probably make 10 hours out if we really wanted to. So if you have any questions about Social Security, or you want to get a little more in the weeds with this, please don't hesitate to reach out to us.
Thanks for joining us for this edition of the KMG Fiduciary Partners podcast. We invite you to catch the next episode in our series for real-world advice from the KMG team. Follow us on LinkedIn at KMG Fiduciary Partners, where we'll keep the conversation going.